Welcome back, quilters, to Snippets with Patterns by Jen. We are going to be making a mini wall hanging, and this is going to be a two-part series. Part one is just making the top, so I will be going over the cutting, trimming, and sewing part of this little wall hanging. Part two will be going over the quilting and finishing of this wall hanging. I will have that linked in the description once that goes live, so 2 weeks from now. For this 16-inch wall hanging, you will need either 2 fat quarters or 2 3/8 yard pieces of fabric, or either one. I am going to be showing you how to cut this. I have 1 fat quarter to use, and I have 1 piece of yardage that is 3/8 yards. And then for the backing, you will want at least an 18-inch square as well as an 18-inch square of batting. All right, we're going to start with the background cutting. For the background, I am going to use this textured background fabric. So a fat quarter is 21 or 22 inches by 18 inches. So I'm going to fold this up and kind of line up the edge. This is the 18-inch edge. I'll line that up kind of with the selvage. And we're going to want to give ourselves a straight edge with this. So to do that, we'll line it up, line that fold up on your mat to make sure we have it nice and perpendicular. And then we're going to trim off as little as possible from the edge, but we want to give ourselves that straight edge to start with. This is the very first step in making sure that you get good, accurate cuts and good accurate quilts when you are done. So for the background, we are going to be cutting 2 8.5-inch squares and 1 9-inch square. So I'll go ahead and cut the 9-inch first. Okay, and so I'm going to line this up. And when I make my cuts, I kind of line my ruler up on the edge of that line. I just want to give myself a little bit more. Now this fat quarter is cut a little funky, so I'm going to go 8.5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that means, as you can see, I'm going to be a little bit short at this end, but I have plenty here on this end, so I'm going to be okay, and I only need 1. So you do want to, before you start making cuts with your fat quarters, go ahead and lay them out and kind of eyeball and estimate, make sure that you're going to have enough. I will have plenty on this end, so I am good. I'm going to set that aside for now. I'm going to rotate this 9-inch strip. So my cut line is again on my mat lined up, because I'm going to again trim off to give myself a nice straight edge. You can see that this is not straight, so I don't want to use that as my guide for cutting my units. So I'm going to trim that off, as well as trim off the selvage, and I want to trim off as little as possible, so I'm going to scoot my ruler over to use the marks on the ruler here. I'm trimming off just as little as possible. You can see there's not much there, but I want to trim that off and give myself a nice straight edge. Now I just need 1 9-inch square, so I'm going to open this up. Now if you have a large square, like a 12.5-inch square, this is a great time to use it so that you are still lining up your ruler and using your ruler to make your cuts. If you don't have it, that is okay. We can still just use our ruler and our mat. Because we are going to be making half square triangles with this 9-inch square, it's not going to be that big of a deal. So we're going to go ahead and count and cut our 9-inch square. We'll set that aside. And now I'm going to fold this up again, and I'm going to trim off a little bit, because now I need an 8.5-inch square. So I'm going to trim this down to 8.5. And again, if you have a large square ruler, this would be a really good time to use it because you do want to use your rulers as much as possible. But if you don't have it, we're going to be okay using this ruler for now. We're going to line up so that we are 8.5 is our cut right now. So now this is 8.5. We're going to open it up and get that 8.5 inch square. A 12.5 inch square ruler is a really handy size to have once you start buying rulers. It's a nice size to have for these types of projects. All right, so here's our 8.5 inch. And even though I'm not going to be using this piece under here because it's not squared off, I'm still going to trim this off. That way I know that edge is straight anyway when I get back to using it for something else. And we will go ahead and trim off again as little as possible here. And I want it to be at 8.5. So this time I'll show you with my square how I usually cut these. So I have my fabric. I need an 8.5 inch square. So I'm going to take my 8.5 inch line on my ruler and I'm going to put it on my fabric. I'm going to bring it all the way to the edge, but I'm going to keep it on the fabric. I don't want it off the edge. I want it on the fabric right here. And then I will just make sure my lines are all straight all the way around. All of it's lined up on the fabric. And I'm using that for my measurement, not the mat. And by doing this with all of your pieces, that again gives you more accuracy than using your mat. Now, I used the mat to show you because not everybody has a 12.5 inch ruler. And so sometimes we have to use what we have. When you get to that point where you can buy a square ruler, you found out that you love this hobby and you want to keep growing, then a 12.5 inch square is a great next purchase for your rulers and to keep your accuracy going from that point on. Now, when we are making squares, half square triangles like we are with these 9-inch squares, then again, using the mat is okay because we're going to be trimming those down anyway, so the accuracy is going to be there once we trim. Let's do the marking because we are going to mark the 9-inch square for our half square triangle. Okay, we're going to mark the wrong side of our 9-inch square. I'm just going to use a regular mechanical pencil and my 24.5 inch ruler. Now, if you don't have a long ruler, you can go ahead and use your shorter one. It's just not going to line, it doesn't reach. So you'll want to go ahead, line up, find your 45-degree mark on your mat and line up your square. And then you can go ahead and take your ruler and you can kind of just keep it eyeballed here and draw, and then move it down a little bit and draw the last end. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead, use my 24.5 ruler and make this mark. Now, when you are marking this line, you'll want to line up your ruler so it is just off to the side of your points to give room for the width of your marking utensil. And that way you're drawing right through the middle of that point. All right. And our background pieces are now ready. So we have one 9-inch square and two 8.5 inch squares. And now we will cut the main fabric. We have this really pretty main fabric that we're going to use for our wall hanging, and this piece is the yardage. So this is just a little bit over 3/8 of a yard, and so about 13.5 inches, just over that. And we're going to first, before we get started, before we make our first cut, before we straighten, give ourselves that first straight cut, we want to get this part straight. So you're going to take your fabric between your fingers here and here. You're not going to hold it very tight. You're going to bring it up, and then you are going to kind of go back and forth with your fingers until you can see that the fabric is lined up straight on the selvage. You don't want your selvage to look like this. Now you can see that it is not straight. So you want to move your fingers back and forth while holding your halfway point here, back and forth until you can see that it is straight all the way down. Now you know that the grain is straight, and you can trim off this edge and give yourself a straight edge to work with. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the fat quarter. We're now going to line up that folded edge on a line on our mat. We're going to trim off as little as possible. So just check to see where you're at here. Okay. And that's why we're trimming and giving ourselves a straight edge, because that is obviously not straight. All right, and for the main fabric now, you need 1 9-inch square and 2 4.5-inch squares. So I'm going to cut a 9-inch strip first. Okay, set aside the extra. And now we're going to give ourselves a straight edge again. So just rotate, line up on a line on your mat so that we can trim off that selvage right there. And now, because I have it straight on my mat and I'm making this cut perpendicular to it, I know that I'm going to have a nice straight edge here to work with as I'm making my next cuts. Now I just need 1 9-inch square. So I'm going to open this up and just count and use my, I'm going to move it to a whole number though, just for my brain. I'm going to count and use my mat again, just so that you see that when I get done with this, it's still accurate because we are trimming. So 9. And then we need 2 4.5-inch squares. So I'm actually just going to cut 1 4.5-inch strip and get my squares from that. So I'm going to line up my 4.5-inch mark on my ruler on the edge of that. I'm not going to worry now if this is lined up because I'm using my ruler to make my cuts. So I have 4.5 inch. I'm going to make sure my lines on my ruler are lined up on the edge here. And then I'm going to switch to the smallest ruler I have to make this the most accurate and easiest. So I'm going to use my 6.5-inch square and make these 1 4.5-inch cut, and we will have 2 squares. All right, now we need to mark the diagonal on the back of these, and we're going to do the same thing that we did with our large 9-inch square. We're going to line our ruler up just to the side, just off the edge, right? We don't want it right in the middle of that point because we want to come in with our pencil and make that mark. And if we're right off to the edge, then that gives a little bit of width and room for our marking utensil. Just a little bit, not very far. Okay, so for our main fabric, we now have 1 9-inch square and 2 4.5-inch squares marked on the wrong side of the fabric. Our next step then is going to be going to the sewing machine and getting these sewn. So I'm going to sew. I'm just going to take all of it over to the sewing machine and do it right there all at one time. So our steps are going to be our half square triangle. So we have our 9-inch main square, and we're going to put our 9-inch background square right sides together with that main, and we're going to sew 1/4 of an inch on both sides of this drawn line. These are going to be our half square triangles, and I will show you how to trim that once we're done with that. We're also going to take our 8.5-inch squares, and we're going to take our 4.5-inch squares from our main fabric, and we are going to sew one 4.5-inch square to each 8.5-inch square. And we are going to sew on the line and have this little piece come over. Okay, so I'm going to take these over as well and sew all of them over there, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about trimming each one and see how this goes together. Okay, so let's first do our half square triangle. So again, we are going to sew 1/4 of an inch on both sides of that line that we drew. And I am going to, with my 1/4 inch foot, I have a guide, so I'm just going to use that. You can draw a 1/4 inch line. I've done that before with a marker. There are other guides that you can use depending on what brand of machine you have. You might have a 1/4 inch foot that comes with your machine, or one that you can buy. The biggest thing is that you do the same seam allowance every time. That's going to give you your most accuracy. Using the same foot and the same guide every time you sew will give you the best accuracy for your blocks. All right, so we're going to rotate and sew 1/4 of an inch down the other side. I'm going to sew the 8.5-inch squares with the 4.5-inch squares. We will go to the cutting mat and I will show you how to trim that half square triangle. But next we're going to do the 8.5-inch squares with the 4.5-inch main squares. So you want to set these up so that they are right sides together. And we are going to sew not exactly on the line, but we are going to sew, we're going to sew right along the inside of the line. So not right on it. You're just going to go like one fiber length over. And that way, when we fold this over and press, we're going to get a nice edge here. So we're going to sew just on the inside of that drawn line. And if you sew right on it, it's not a big deal. And because it is hard to see that line, depending on the foot that you have. My foot makes it very difficult. And so it's kind of just a guess for me on if I'm getting to the side of it or not. And we're going to do that with both squares. So both 8.5-inch squares get a 4.5-inch main square. Okay. So we will go back to the cutting mat and we will go ahead and talk about pressing these and trimming off the excess and going ahead and trimming this half square triangle. I'm going to go over the background squares with the 4.5-inch squares first because that's pretty easy, and then we will go over the half square triangle and how to trim those up. So we are going to go ahead, just clip this, and then we're going to press. So we're just going to take our hot iron, hit those seams, and then bring that over and press that down. And one of these I did really well and the other one not so well, but we still get, this one is the one that I didn't get, it was a little bit off of the line there, but you can see instead of a funky edge where maybe I'm coming up a little bit short because I sewed right on the line, I've got a nice edge here that when I sew is going to be picked up really nicely in there. All right, so next we need to trim off that excess. So I'm going to set that over. So we've got this pressed, and our next step then will be to just open this up and trim off that excess. So you're going to line up the 1/4 inch mark on your ruler. You're going to line that up right on your stitch line, right on that seam that we just sewed. You're going to line that 1/4 inch mark on your ruler, you're going to line that up on that so that we are not cutting that seam, and you're going to trim off that excess fabric. And now you have a nice square. Okay, so again, you're just going to line up that 1/4 inch mark on your ruler. It's going to line up right on your stitching. You're going to trim that off. Now you have that 1/4 inch seam and you have a nice block. Okay, so let's do our half square triangle. For this half square triangle, it is much larger than we usually do, and so that 12.5-inch square comes in really handy. But I will show you how to square it up without the 12.5-inch square so that you can still make this project work. We are going to go ahead and cut on that drawn line and just put that long ruler on there and cut. And now we will just press. You can press either to the background or the main fabric. It does not matter. I'm going to press it to the main because my main is darker than the background. But if your background is darker, you can press it to that one. It doesn't really matter if you do darker or lighter either, whichever you prefer. All right, so we're going to just hit that seam with that hot iron again and open this up. And this is a pretty big piece, so I think I'm just going to open it up and then finger press a little bit so that I don't have to worry about stretching this fabric out or catching that seam and getting it flipped out underneath while I am pressing. We're going to trim these half square triangles down to 8.5-inch square. For this first trim, I'm going to show it with the 12.5-inch square just so we can show you with a square ruler, and then I will show you how to do it with a ruler that is not square. Okay, so we are going to square this to 8.5. So you want to line up your diagonal right on that sewn seam. And then you want to make sure you have fabric all the way around. And it's going to be close with these squares. When they're the larger squares, they just seem to come out a little closer. We're going to be trimming off very, very little, and that is okay. And you can see, I barely cut any. And I want that to be true for the first cut because I don't want to be trimming off a bunch on the first cut and then rotate and then my ruler slips and now I don't have anything to trim off on my last cut. So I'm going to want to take less on that first cut. So we're going to line up again that 8.5-inch line on my fabric, line up my diagonal, and make that trim. All right. So very, very little are we trimming off, but it does make a difference in our accuracy. So we'll set that one aside, and now we will do I'll do another one, but I'll show you how to do it with a regular ruler. Okay, for this one, we are going to be using the triangle that we did not press. This is going to be different, and I just want to give you a way to do these larger triangles with what you have. So if you don't have a square and you don't have a large mat, I don't want you to feel like you can't make this, and we're just going to make it work for you so that you can make this wall hanging with us and have a pretty project at the end. So we're going to have this triangle, and we are going to go ahead and line it up in our little square here that it's a 10-inch square. Now if you don't have that on your mat, then we will go ahead and just use the marks on your ruler. Just go with it, start with at your 10-inch. Don't bring it over to where your 1-inch is over here. Work in the middle of your mat. That's just going to give you a little bit more freedom. So go ahead and use it as the 10-inch mark on your mat if you don't have this 10-inch square. Okay? We're going to have this folded and we're going to line it up on the line. So we have the 10-inch, and then this one is my 5-inch. If you don't have the 10-inch square, we've got a 10-inch mark here in our 5-inch. It does not matter which one you're using. I do like the 10 because we're going to be trimming off at 8.5. So that just makes it easier on in my brain. All right, so we're at this 10-inch line, and we are going to take our triangle and we are going to line up that seam right where the corner comes together here, okay? So you're going to line that up right on that corner, and you're going to have your triangle lined up straight on this line. So this is my 5-inch line. My seam is going to come right where my 10 and my 5 meet. So there should be a little dog ear hanging off because you want it to be where that seam point comes. Okay, and then you want this to be nice and straight. And you can see my line, this doesn't come together. That's why we trim. Okay, and we're going to trim off at the 8.5-inch mark. So you're going to count over 8.5, which is why it's nice to have this 10-inch square in the middle. We've got it already marked, but here, because we're on the 10, we just go to that 18.5-inch mark, and we're going to trim there. And I'm going to, so here is the cut, because here's my my seam allowance, right? I'm going to move my ruler markings just to this side of that line on my mat, because again, I always like to give myself just a few more fibers to work with. So we're going to go ahead and trim. Take that off. Okay. Now we're going to take it, and now we need to trim this side. Okay. So we're just going to take it, flip. So it's this way now. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to line up that seam, and we're going to go ahead and trim at that 8.5-inch mark. So again, making sure that this seam is at that, comes to that corner, and you have a little dog ear there. And then we're going to, and this is nice and straight on the mat, we'll trim this off. I'm going to line up so that my ruler markings are just a little bit off of the ruler, off of the mat. And now we will press. Okay, so I'm going to hit my triangle seam with a hot iron, and I will finger press. Again, I'm pressing to the main fabric because it is the darker fabric, but it doesn't matter which way you want to press. And we'll go ahead and press. Okay, and now we have our 8.5-inch square. Now, because we trim like that, we still have these little dog ears, and you can just come in and give them a quick little clip. And you've got your half square triangle at 8.5 inches. So again, it isn't the traditional way. It isn't, but it gets it done, and then you can move on with this project. So we're going to lay this out and make our little wall hanging. All right, here we go. Here's our wall hanging. So I love this little spool. We have our half square triangles with the main fabric coming in, and then we have our 8.5 with our main 4.5-inch squares. Those are also in the center. And the way that this is put together means we don't have to worry about these seams lining up with anything, and that's always nice when you don't have to match up a seam. So we're going to take it over like this. I just like to flip them, and then I'll come over here and I will take it over to the sewing machine like this, knowing that this is the side that I'm going to sew, and that's how I always stack it, just to keep them in order. Now you can always also just take them one folded piece over at a time. It doesn't matter. Then we're going to sew these. We'll come back and we'll press in the right direction. and pin them and sew that last seam. We are very close. Okay, to sew these, we are just going to put them right sides together. Watch your seam on the other side that it doesn't get flipped over. And to do that, you just want to, as you're sewing, as you're coming up to it, you just want to feel it where it's coming at. And I'm going to just make sure that your block stays lined up. And we'll go ahead and you can feel the seam here. That's what I mean when I say just, kind of keep your fingers on it. You can feel it. Now this one is already going the right direction, so it won't flip. But on the next one, I think it is going the opposite, but it is also on top, so we won't have to worry about it too much. So again, we'll line up right sides together, and I leave my pieces in. I don't cut the thread in between. We're just going to do some small chain piecing here. And that, not only does that keep your momentum going, it also saves thread. We're going to go ahead and keep going now. The half square triangle seam, I can feel, you want to just make sure that stays up, I can feel is going to try and flip. So I do want to hold on to that as I come. And so I'm holding it down all the way up here because it will flip there as well. All right, so we're going to go press these. Okay, so we will just clip our threads quick, and we will go ahead and press towards the half square triangle units. So hit with that hot iron. And again, because these are pretty big, I'll finger press. Just be careful. This is a hot iron, so don't get your fingers burned. And then I'm going to come and go straight down. And then as I come to this little corner right here, I'm just going to keep my fingers there until the iron is right there, because it does want to flip with that extra, just that extra bulk there. It just wants to flip a little bit. Okay, and so because we pressed towards those half square triangles, that means that our seams now will nest really nicely. So we're going to pin these. And I will put a link in the description to my how-to pinning video if you haven't seen it yet and you would like to get a close-up. That uses solid fabric and red thread, so it's really easy to see. But we're going to take our seams, we're going to nest them up. They just kind of lock right into place. They just kind of click. You're going to take your pin, you're going to go down on the right side of that seam and come up on the left of it. And that way when we come to, as we're sewing, when we come to it, we can take one stitch with our sewing machine right over that seam. That locks that seam in place, and then we can take our pin out, and then that's how we get our very nice corners to stay. So we'll go sew that right now. Okay, so we're going to sew this together. And now, again, we don't have any seams to match up except for this one in the center that we have pinned. So we're just going to match up those corners, keep the edges together, and sew this last seam. And you just want to, again, keep your finger on those seams below that are underneath on the bottom, just to kind of keep an eye on them, make sure they're where they're supposed to be and they aren't flipping on you. And we're going to come to this one. Now this seam on the bottom is flipped that way, so we want to make sure it stays that way. So use a chopstick or a stylus to do that. And then we're going to come up to, and I have to go up one more time because my guide catches on that pin. But we're going to go ahead, we're going to sew and go one stitch over that seam. And again, and then we're going to take our pin out. The link that I have will go over that as well. And now we've taken that pin out, but we have already locked in that seam together because we took that stitch before we took that pin out. All right, and we're going to go ahead and sew the rest of this. Now, I just made sure that I took this. You can, if you like, and I do this sometimes if my fabric is a little bit off. I'll match up my corners and then go ahead and just stick a pin in there, and then I know that those corners are going to come out together and even and nice. And then we'll go ahead and watch that seam. You can see it's going to come up, so I'm going to make sure I get my presser foot over that. And we are done. Let's go press this. All right, let's clip these threads and hit this with a hot iron. Again, I'm going to quick finger press to make sure the seam, because of this bulk here, I want that all to go the right way. And because we pinned correctly, we have a nice center point. All right, and come back with our hot iron, press straight down, and we have the top to our mini wall hanging. There she is. Pretty simple, pretty cute. I think she will make a great little addition to any sewing space or your living room, whatever you want it to be. Come back in 2 weeks and we will go over how to finish her up. We're going to quilt, we will bind, we will put on a hanging sleeve, and we'll have a finished project. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. Come back in 2 weeks. Go make something you love.